Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this week's Industry Insights. I am your host, Leah Troscianecki, Principal Product Marketing Manager for our enterprise team, and I am joined today by my good friend, Jeff Reichard. Jeff, would you like to say hi to everyone?
Hi, delighted to be back on Industry Insights. Thanks, Leah. My name is Jeff Reichard. I'm the Vice President of Solution Strategy on Veeam's Product Strategy team. So always good to be on Industry Insights.
Absolutely. And we are back from a brief hiatus on our ransomware trends series. Today, we are going to be talking about the financial impacts that we noticed from the ransomware trends report. And again, Veeam has a very healthy research arm here at Veeam. We work with a third-party firm to interview thousands of IT leaders, security teams, all around the world to better understand various trends across data protection, cloud adoption, and of course, ransomware. So for this particular study, we pulled together insights across how often did you get attacked, how did you get attacked, what did you do when you got attacked, and specifically, we're going to be looking at some of the trends we observed around those financial impacts. So think, did they pay the ransom? What was your policy around ransom? Did you use insurance? And what were some of the other costs associated with that attack? So that's all of what we're going to be talking about today. I would love to see everyone engage in this week's Industry Insights. So from wherever you're tuning in, or if you're catching us on a recording, please go ahead and use that comment function. We would love to hear from you about some of the questions you have. We know that not everyone loves to openly talk about what happened with their ransomware attacks. We totally understand. But as a community, it helps us to stay connected and to better understand what each other is going through. So if you have questions about anything to do with ransomware trends, but specifically about those financial attacks, please use that comment function. We're going to be monitoring all of the platforms here live. We'll be sure to pull those comments up and talk about them on today's broadcast. Additionally, if you'd like to engage with us, we would love to hear where you're calling in from. So if you're calling in from a certain state in the United States or a city around the world, please let us know. We actually have an interactive map that we do feature on Industry Insights. So a bit later in the presentation, we're going to talk about that map. We'll pull it up and see where everyone's calling in from. So use that comment function. We'd love to hear from you guys. But to go ahead and start things off, we will start with a very tantalizing stat, taking a look at whether or not folks from the survey paid the ransom. When you think about the cost of a ransomware attack, this would be the top thing that you think about. Did you pay the ransom? And again, a lot of organizations have policies about paying the ransom. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But there are realities when you actually are faced with a ransomware attack. 81% of survey respondents said their organization paid the ransom. That is a sobering and stark stat for everyone in the IT and security space. But let's break down some of the color specifically around that 81% stat. 54% said yes, and we were able to recover the data. The idea behind a ransom is, hey, I've encrypted your data, pay me money, I give you a key. That's lovely, but 27% said they paid it and they were not able to recover their data. Either they never got a key, the key didn't work, some or all of their data was already damaged. There's anything that can happen when you pay that ransom. You'll also see some other information in here too. Jeff, I'll bring you in here. I know one of the things that we think is important for everyone to recognize is that 4% of the time the ransomware was asked, no ransom was asked for during an attack. It's a sort of, chaos agent, right? Some people are just in it for the chaos. So Jeff, I know you and I kind of talked about that stat when we were first looking at this data way back when it came out. But is there any color commentary you want to add here from the field?
Yeah, there's a lot that we can talk about when we unpack this. I like focusing on the 4%. I still have conversations, and Leah, as you know, I do this both at industry events and speaking directly with Veeam customers and potential customers multiple times a week. I still talk with IT leaders who are completely aware themselves of what the threat landscape looks like, of the fact that their organization is dealing with existential risk, but they have people in financial or executive, or if they're public sector, elected leadership who choose to say, well, it's probably not going to happen to us, but even if it does, we can pay the ransom and recover. That 4% is steady. We have seen that in the last several ransomware trends reports. This sort of basically an arson attack where there's nothing at all you can do because they're only trying to burn your data down. They're not trying to even financially profit, is a steady factor in the way that these attacks happen. And if you think back actually to the most damaging ransomware attack in history so far, which is NotPetya back in the spring and summer of 2017, that was actually a wiper malware attack. It was politically motivated. It escaped the bounds of Ukraine, who was the target for it, and caused globally over $10 billion worth of damage. There were still insurance claims from NotPetya that were being litigated into last year, 6 years later. So this situation where you might get attacked and it wouldn't be possible even to pay a ransom to save yourself is not far-fetched. I want to focus too on the 27% that you mentioned. If you think that 81% paid the ransom, it's very easy math. If you divide 81 by 3, 27% is 1/3 of those who paid the ransom. 1/3 of those who chose to pay the ransom paid but couldn't get their data back. We talk with lately, since Veeam acquired Coveware, the incident response firm that we bought as a company earlier on this year, still operating as an independent entity. But Coveware has responded to many thousands of ransomware attacks over the last several years. And what they say is that it's actually not uncommon for the threat actor to make mistakes in their encryption algorithms so that even though they intend to cleanly encrypt the data and not corrupt it, they accidentally corrupt the data because they make errors in code the same way that every other software manufacturer makes errors in code sometimes. And so they inadvertently corrupt data. And there are situations when folks pay for a ransom key, just like this 27%, only to find out that the threat actor intended to let them decrypt their data, but it wasn't actually possible. It's really sobering to look at this. And again, going back to the way that I started talking about this, if there's anyone in your organization who thinks that you can slap a Band-Aid on this problem by paying a ransom, these numbers should help you to make the case that that's absolutely not true.
Definitely. And one of the things that Coveware has kind of impressed upon us as a Veeam team too, is this idea that you may go ahead and need to pay that ransom, and there are situations where it makes sense, but that it's really important that you consider who you're bringing into the conversation to make that decision. One of the hot topics that actually came up out at a Coveware-led roundtable at our recent VeeamON in Fort Lauderdale was this idea of whether or not you should bring in law enforcement, the authorities, right? There were several folks in the room who said it is our internal policy to not inform the authorities because there is this perception that the authorities will get in the way of remediation processes and or recommend or strongly prevent you from your ability to pay the ransom if that is what your organization chooses. And it was so important to the Coveware team that we really bust that myth that is what the authorities are there to do. The authorities are not there to slow down these processes or prevent you from doing what you need to do to get your business back up and running. Instead, they want to better understand these bad actors, collate those best practices so that they can advise future organizations who are placed in this position. So that's a nice little piece of color commentary that we can sort of impress upon everyone is myth busting this idea that you shouldn't bring the authorities in. It's Coveware's position, and we're so proud to work with the Coveware team because they come with such a tremendous amount of experience in these real world scenarios that we can hopefully myth bust some of these common misconceptions.
Totally true. And they have the same goal that Veeam has, which I know you've heard us say this before, if you've looked at these reports with us before, but that 15%, that sort of lonely green slice of the ransomware paying or not paying pie, we want to make it bigger, and Coveware wants to make it bigger. Ideally, we're going to get to a point where that 15% becomes 30% and then ultimately 100% because organizations have gone past the requirement to save their data and save their operations by paying criminals a ransom.
That may or may not be why the color is in green on this chart. Just saying, we really want to paint the town green here. Awesome. Well, that's the reality is let's talk about what the plan may have been. So if we take a look at this chart here, this to pay or not to pay, that is the question for the Shakespeare fans out there. There are a wide variety of internal policies in place, and we did see some regionality to this. I think that's important to note. Certainly there are different motivations and kind of trends and propensities in the ransomware and cyber attack space. So for wherever you're calling in from, you can take a look at your specific region to better understand what the policies are that are in place today. A shocking number of companies, especially for North America and EMEA, where there are significant threat vectors and threat actors, there is no policy around whether or not their organization will pay the ransom. I found that to be very interesting, and I think we can debate whether or not that's a wise choice to not have a policy. 34% in North America, 38% in EMEA said the policy was not to pay. And then ultimately, a little less than half, depending on what region you're looking at, the policy was to go ahead and pay. Pretty significant delta between reality and the plan. So Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about the organizations you've worked with so far and what their approach has been to making these kinds of decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. What you mentioned just now, that there is a significant delta between the plan that organizations make around paying and what they actually end up doing when faced with unrecoverable data after an attack, is dead on. We see some small differences between the theoretical, the pre-event willingness to pay in Latin America and in Asia Pacific region. We see a slightly larger percentage there who have policies not to pay if you add them up, but it's basically rounds out to the same. We also asked this question, and for certain verticals, for example, financial services, public sector, we asked those folks what their policies were. We're not going to publish that here, but unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that whatever the pre-existing policy may have been, if an organization feels that it is faced with an existential threat, they typically pay the ransom. It is the same kind of decision, unfortunately, that people who are faced with, a loved family member being kidnapped and held for ransom or something like that, are often deal with. If they are genuinely concerned that this could be the end, they pay the ransom. And they do that whether they're in a sector, for example, public sector, that has a longstanding official policy against paying ransoms or not. What's interesting when we talk about this, the fact that there are regulations being mooted out there in different jurisdictions about forbidding ransom, it's something that insurers and that a lot of cybersecurity experts, when you read what they write about this, strongly discourage governments from putting in place, because what they tend to say is that if you, as a matter of policy, forbid organizations from paying ransom, but they're going to go out of business if they don't pay a ransom, what they will in many cases do, and this is backed by experience, what organizations have seen those threatened companies do, is they will just engage in activity that's sanctioned by law in order to pay the ransom. So it's really sort of victimizing them twice if you do that. There are better ways to ensure that ransomware threat actors go out of business. And we can kind of see that because even where there were strict internal policies, not outside legislative, but inside policies not to pay, once a company is faced with going out of business, the whole calculus changes.
It does really change, right? And so there are realities that you need to face. Hopefully this helps you all as you're taking a look at what your organization is faced with. And speaking of kind of what your organization is faced with, we recognize that so many of you are operating in these multinational environments. So again, that's part of why we did want to publish these regional stats. So feel free to download the full ransomware trends report. We have the QR code and the short link here on the slide. So if you'd like to go ahead and download that and take that back to your colleagues, hopefully this will be a good resource for you all. We're going to go ahead and take a quick housekeeping break here because we've been scouring the chats across all the different platforms that we live stream from. And we have some entries that let us know where you all are calling in from. So we're going to go ahead and put the map up here, and you can see that we've got some folks from all over the world. I am calling in from the Ohio State. I'm very close to Ohio State University's campus. Jeff is joining me from the great state of Connecticut. We have production calling in from the great state of Texas. And then if we travel down south here, we always have a strong contingent from Brazil. Thank you all so much for joining us. And then if we pop across the Atlantic, take a look at Europe, we have some folks calling in from France, from Romania, where Veeam has a huge office. So thank you so much to our folks in Romania. And Jeff and I are always excited to see anyone calling in from South Africa. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the participation and hanging out with you guys. Please keep letting us know where you're calling in from in the chat, and let us know if you have additional questions. We've gotten a few folks asking some technical questions in the chat, so we'll be sure to reply to those during or after the live stream. But let us know how you all are reacting to some of this data that we've gone through so far. That's certainly something that we can pull live and chat about as a team. So let us know if you have any questions about this data that you're seeing here. But with that, let's go ahead and pop in and talk about more data, specifically looking at ransomware insurance, right? How did your organization pay the ransom? And ultimately, there is a wide variety of answers to this question. 38% paid through a cyber-specific insurance coverage. We continue to see that rate increase year over year. 27% paid through other insurance. We do see that somewhat decreasing due to a variety of factors, certainly the availability of generalized insurance being possible to use for ransomware. Paid by company, though there was an insurance option. Again, insurance is there to be used if you need it, but sometimes it is just better to pull from those internal resources. 6% paid by company, not insured or covered. And then 8% used a ransomware warranty provided by an IT vendor. So again, a wide variety of approaches. There isn't a sort of silver bullet that makes sense for every organization, especially when you consider the size of the organization, whether or not there has been a recent cyber attack that makes it more difficult to get insured. So I think we're just going to continue to see, as an IT industry, that there's going to be new offerings provided, shrinking offerings that we expect to see. And it'll just be really interesting, I think, to see whether or not organizations keep using insurance moving forward, and if that has a higher propensity versus using internal resources to pay for this cost. So Jeff, again, I know you talk a lot with our current customers, some prospects. How are they contending with insurance? I know certainly Veeam has our own ransomware warranty program as part of our really exciting Veeam cybersecure program that combines Coveware services, other kinds of technical and professional services offerings, as well as that ransomware warranty. But how are organizations thinking about this today?
Well, what's been interesting about the cyber insurance market, especially if we take a slightly longer view over the last 5 or 6 years, initially it was a fairly young industry and there was kind of a land rush to get market share. If you think it's comparable to the way that many online businesses accept losses, or new tech startups accept losses for years because they want to gain market share with the anticipation that their business model will mature, maybe they'll raise prices a little bit or get costs under control and then become profitable. And that's worked for a lot of companies. What's interesting in the insurance space is that cyber insurers had less idea how to calculate risk, what the actuarial tables looked like for genuine cyber risk, and frankly still do, than they had about the risks of things like hurricane, fire, and flood damage. Those are much better understood than cyber insurance risks. So the market, after an initial period where insurers were rushing to get business and ended up losing their shirts in some big cyber ransomware attacks, then began tightening up. And it became harder to get cyber insurance. The list of controls that you needed became much, much more prescriptive, including being able to prove those, not just attest, yes, we have multi-factor authentication everywhere, but okay, have it audited and prove that, show us that that's the case. Of course, insurers don't make money by paying out on claims, right? Their goal is to not pay out on claims. And one of the good side effects of the tightening cyber insurance market is as they ask insured organizations to provide more information, we have been getting a little bit better about what we've been doing. I think that we'll continue to see maybe more organizations do this themselves rather than do it through insurance. And I think we'll continue to see the market tightening up over the next couple of years.
Definitely. And I think that's especially true when we start to recognize that there's a wide variety of costs that come from these ransomware attacks. We've been spending a lot of time talking about the ransom itself and was there a policy? In actuality, did you pay? But we're going to spend the rest of this live stream talking a bit about some of the other kinds of costs that we've seen organizations face. And again, we think that's going to be a forcing function for changes in this particular insurance and warranty space. As Jeff said, because the actuary science behind this is so difficult to forecast, there's an incredible amount of risk for organizations that choose to insure these kinds of issues. And again, we're going to continue to see a higher preponderance of ransomware attacks, increasing sophistication. So it's just a mismatch market of demand versus what can be fulfilled ultimately. So let's continue to increase the scare factor here and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we commonly hear around response and recovery specifically. And this is just not meant to be an exhaustive list, but things for you to consider as you're thinking about taking this data back to your team and asking some of these critical questions. If you are hardcore in the backup space, certainly speed of response time on the recovery side, that's key. But you may not be aware of what the speed of response time might look like for your security team colleagues, right? So that's an opportunity cost that needs to be weighed in all of this. As far as the response plans go, what is the accuracy of those response plans? Have they thought about this specific kind of threat actor and scenario? What are the IT and security tools that are in play, and have they been immobilized? Have they actually been affected by this particular kind of attack? Are there incomplete inventories, right? Data on average doubles in size every single year. So the sprawl and the mismanagement is a very real threat in terms of even trying to calculate the cost for your particular organization, let alone these islands of understanding, right? We have a lot of tribal knowledge that lives with individual IT and security teams that don't have time to talk to each other. So that tribal knowledge increases the risk and the threat for your organization. And then, of course, some of these common things around state and frequency of backups, whether or not they are in fact recoverable, are the teams communicating with each other? It is just tremendously complicated to think about response and recovery, and it introduces an incredible amount of risk. Risk is cost for IT organizations. So Jeff, again, as we've been talking with our current Veeam customers about their response plans, and then ultimately taking a look at where the industry is going, how do you think this is going to impact the sort of calculus behind total cost of ownership, whether it makes sense to make improvements, make enhancements to people, process, technology? All of those things are costly. So what are you hearing right now in terms of talking with current organizations?
So these specific challenges are ones that we call out when we do incident response drills with customers and prospective customers. We make it fun, we make it interactive. The goal is to introduce some chaos and to broaden folks' perspective on the number of internal and external challenges to different actors who are going to be involved in a ransomware response. And exactly as you pointed out, because there tend to be such a scope of things that are disrupted, such a wide scope of folks who are involved, it all adds up to unanticipated time for recovery and often unanticipated cost for recovery. And fortunately, we've got some data on that from the Ransomware Trends Report too.
We definitely do. And let's go ahead and close out with that. So the ransom is only a certain part of this total cost, right? And we found that the ransom was just 32% on average of the total financial impact, right? The other thing that's really stark here is 62% of overall costs were recoverable through insurance. So we just talked about how challenging it's been for organizations to look at their current insurance policies, figure out if they need to fill those gaps or if they need to fill those gaps with internal funding. And yet, even if you solve for that, 62% of those overall costs were recoverable through insurance. So this is just a tremendous burden for organizations to face, this reality that it's so difficult to calculate the total cost of this experience, whether it's trying to predict how much the ransom might be or trying to calculate the total cost to your business of recovery time, recovery point objectives, da 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 da. And then you add in the complication of how you will get that paid for and how much that is tremendously changing. But again, we don't mean for this to be a specifically doom and gloom conversation. This is stark, this is scary, but that is all the more reason for IT and security teams and vendors like us to band together and share best practices, improve these technologies, stay vigilant, and stay ultimately resilient in the face of these kinds of attacks. Because ultimately, and Jeff, I know you have a Fed background, I have a Fed background as well. We really believe strongly that it's so important for organizations like Veeam to stay on the forefront of making sure that these terrorists don't win at the end of the day. Yep. So we don't mean for this to be doom and gloom, but these are some stark realities that we want to increase the urgency with. And hopefully these numbers are things that you can take back to your organization. Before we wrap up, Jeff, any last thoughts, concerns, ideas that you want to highlight?
It's a truism, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so knowing this beforehand, knowing all the moving parts, knowing that you'll only be able to get back maybe less than 2/3 of the total impact of a ransomware attack through insurance. So much better to minimize that impact up front by having resilient, survivable backups, by having tested incident response plans, by having the right security controls in place. Simple things like MFA and the general other sets of controls that go along with zero trust security frameworks can go a long way to making sure that all of these numbers are as small as they can be.
And speaking of all of those tools, that's actually going to be something that next week's Industry Insights talks about. It's almost like we planned it that way. Jeff and I will be off the air next week. You're going to be joined by Jason Buffington, who is our leader of all of this amazing research, as well as Emily Tejas. And she comes to us from the product strategy team, where she is boots on the ground working with organizations day in and day out. And she is one of our experts in a lot of these security integrations. So if you're looking for ways that your Veeam stack can actually integrate with your security team's stack, that show should give you some really cool and interesting ideas to take back to joint efforts between IT and security. Before we close out, we want to pull up the map again, actually, because we had some additional folks let us know where they were calling from. So we just want to take a moment to thank some of you all who let us know some additional spots. We have someone calling in from Chicago, one of my absolute favorite cities in the United States. We also have someone calling in from Bermuda. Over in Europe, we've got Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and then we had a couple of folks calling in from APJ as well. So thank you to those of you who are calling in from India and Thailand. It is very late for you in Thailand, so thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your day. We are off of the air on Thursday. We have a holiday in the United States, our 4th of July Independence Day. So the Tech Bytes team is going to be off the air, but they will come back next Thursday for a really great session hosted by our Veeam 100, which is our community leadership group. And they are going to be talking about Kubernetes. So I think that'll be a really fantastic session for any of you who might work in the container space. But with that, I'll go ahead and sign off on myself and on behalf of myself and my colleague, Jeff. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next show.